Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel. Sorry for such a long delay between posting videos. About a month ago, I started kind of a big home improvement project, and the bad news is it's been taking up most of my time, and I sort of had to tear down my studio space. But the good news is it does include some significant upgrades to my studio space, so, whatever. But anyway, with that out of the way, let's jump into the video. When the Darkbase 900 launched back in 2016, I was immediately intrigued by the look of the case, the modularity of the case, and it looked like a case that would be a really fun project case or something you could do a really nice custom loop in. Unfortunately, I just don't really like big cases, so I passed on it. Not to say that the builds that I've seen in that case haven't been awesome, but it's just not really my style. And unfortunately, there haven't been a lot of really good mid-tower options on the market recently either, at least none that I've really liked. But BeQuiet kind of came to the rescue towards the end of last year and launched the Darkbase 700. Now the Darkbase 700 retained pretty much all the features that I liked about the Darkbase 900, but in a smaller form factor. Now it's still a decent sized case, but it is a mid-tower and quite a bit smaller than the Darkbase 900. So immediately I knew that I had to do a build in this case. So I reached out to BeQuiet, I threw some ideas at them for an upcoming project, and they were kind enough to send one over for me. Now this video is not meant to be a full-on review of the Darkbase 700. I'm going to go ahead and link a couple good reviews down below from BPS Customs and Science Studio. This is more or less a video designed to sort of showcase what is possible inside of the Darkbase 700. My goal was to fully take advantage of the modularity of the case as well as the size of the case, create a nice custom loop, throw in a little bit of modding, and create something unique to show you guys. Now before I get into the walkthrough of the build, I'm just going to go ahead and say this case was an absolute pleasure to build in. Anyone considering a mid-tower, especially if you want to do maybe some modding or create a custom loop, this should definitely be on your short list, probably right up there with the new Fractal Define R6. Now I know when it comes to choosing a case, it's largely subjective. I happen to like the style of this case. I think it's a pretty sleek look, but more than anything, I just love what's possible and what you can create inside of this case. But without further ado, let's jump into the walkthrough so I can show you guys what I was able to create inside of the BeQuiet Darkbase 700. Alright, so let's take a closer look. The first obvious thing you're going to notice is just the sheer amount of space that you have to work with inside of the Darkbase 700, which for someone who likes to do modding and custom water cooling loops, that's obviously a welcome feature to any mid-tower case. I would say this one is a little bit on the larger size, but not by much. It's comparable to any of the other mid-tower cases on the market. It just kind of looks a little bit bulkier, and I don't know if that's because of the design of it, but it's nice. It's very sleek. I'm not really going to comment too much on the overall design of the case because that's going to be largely subjective, but I can definitely make some comments on the features that you will get with this case. Now, I don't really care too much about all the different lighting stuff and some of the other things that are built into the case. You guys can kind of decide that for yourself, and if you've already watched some of the other reviews on some of the other channels, you can kind of get an idea on what that stuff is. But my favorite feature, hands down, of this case is the ability to invert the motherboard tray. So I'm obviously not going to be able to go into too much detail on how that's done, but I can say that the way that BeQuiet sort of engineered this case, they made the process, I would say, easy as long as you follow the directions, and it works really well. I mean, it really looks like the case was sort of meant to be this way. It wasn't an afterthought at all. The modularity is very impressive. Now, I will confess, obviously you guys are seeing a lot of panels in this case that are non-standard, so maybe you aren't getting the best idea of what this case might look like if you were to build a loop in here without doing any of these custom panels, but I can assure you that it's still going to look good. I just use panels, and you've probably seen this in previous builds. I use the panels to sort of clean up the overall aesthetic of the build and to kind of do some creative stuff like what I've done with the cables, where I route them through the panels, and then obviously the pass-throughs. So yeah, you're going to get a ton of space to work with. You've got support for very large radiators. I've got a 360 in the front and a 240 up top, which provides plenty of cooling capacity. For this particular loop, it's a 6700K and a GTX 1080. So obviously this is more than enough to keep temps nice and cool, and it fits really well. The top tray does pull out. You've probably seen that already, and allows you to mount the fans and radiator and then slide it back in and then mount it with a couple screws. It's pushed really far forward in the case, which, I mean, I don't know how I feel about that. I feel like it's really far forward. I mean, this radiator here is almost flush with the case. The good news is it gives you tons of space to work with as far as with your motherboard, but they may have pushed it forward a little bit too much, but I don't know. It worked out just fine. I'm not a fan of this closed off panel on the top. I like the way that Fractal does theirs, where you have the option to pull the Moduvent off and give yourself better cooling capacity. This sucker gets extremely hot to the touch when this system's under full load. I haven't had any issues with temps getting out of hand, but I don't know. I could see if maybe you were doing a little bit something more aggressive. Maybe you had a second video card. I would definitely have concerns about how well this case would be able to handle that, because the airflow is not the greatest. Now, granted, BeQuiet, hence the name, is going more for a quiet case. But again, I like the way that Fractal gives you the option to either have a quiet system or pull the Moduvent off and allow for better cooling. But that's going to be up to you guys to decide, based on the components of your system and sort of what your priorities are, whether or not this case is going to make sense for you. But for me, it works out very well, and I'm extremely pleased with the way I was able to do an inverted build like this and have it turn out looking the way it did. And as far as the basement goes, and I'm going to have to show you the underside of this by spinning the case around here in a minute, there is tons of room to work with in this basement, as well as behind, and I'll show you guys that as well. So that's another nice feature for modders and people that are doing custom loops, is you get tons of space to work with, and that just opens up more possibilities to get creative. As you can see here, I built this particular loop using pass-throughs and hid some of the components. I've got my reservoir sort of suspended here, so it's basically held in place with the fitting and pass-through at the bottom and a fitting and pass-through at the top. Now, in order for me to fill this, I do have to pull the top panel off, which isn't really that big a deal, but I did have to create a panel and a pass-through up there as well to sort of get this sort of loop. Other than that, I mean, this is pretty straightforward, guys. As with all of my builds, it's all EK blocks, Bits Power Black Sparkle fittings, Bits Power 12 millimeter Crystal Link acrylic tubing, and then all custom cabling done by me. This is the first time I've done this sort of like two-tone look. I'm really pleased with the way that it came out. I think that the color choice was pretty obvious why I chose it. I figured it'd be a nice homage to BeQuiet, since the goal with this build was to sort of show off what is, what this case is capable of doing. But aside from that, if you guys have any questions about, anything that you're seeing here or how I did certain things in this build, as always, feel free to ask. Either, shoot me a private message or, put something down in the comments. I always try to do my best to answer that stuff for you. I've got my lighting hidden behind these two panels. This is another thing that you guys will kind of see a common theme that I do in a lot of my builds. I don't like seeing the LED, the actual diodes are really harsh. So it's always best to kind of shroud that, so that as you're looking at your build, the LEDs are illuminating the inside of the build, but not reflecting back or, hitting you in the eyes, or else it's just going to be too harsh. So I've got a strip hidden behind this panel here, and then I've got a strip hidden behind this panel here. And it was kind of designed not only to illuminate the inside of the build, but to wash out this fluid, because this is Mayhem's Pastel Extreme. And in just normal light, it has this sort of like milky appearance to it. I don't know how well it shows up on the camera, but when you hit it with some bright LEDs, it really just almost glows white. So, you'll probably see that in some of the pictures and maybe some of the B-roll, the way the fluid illuminates, but it definitely looks better under lighting than it does just kind of in natural light. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and spin this around and give you guys a look at the back side of the case as well as the basement. So here's the back side of the case. As I mentioned before, I've got tons of space to work with as far as routing cables. This looks like at least an inch, but regardless, it's plenty of space to find ways to route your cables. And with the case just being as large as it is, and it being a fairly open area back here, there's really just, I don't want to say an infinite amount, but there's a lot of different ways that you could route cables back here. Now, I am using the included fan splitter, which I think is pretty awesome. The only downside is that you can switch back and forth between either using the little toggle on the front or PWM control. I would have liked if there was a separate PWM control for the two sides, because you get like 3 PWM inputs here, 3 here. But unfortunately, if you switch to PWM mode, then you're controlling every fan from that one input, which is working out okay, but ideally I would prefer to have individual control over each of these zones. But regardless, I think overall it's still a pretty neat feature of the case. You can also control your your LED strips from here. I'm not using that, but well, aside from the front LEDs do also connect into here. And then you have the option to either use the toggle on the front, or you can hook up to the RGB header on your motherboard. So BeQuiet did a great job of giving you the options that you could potentially need there. But aside from that, I think it was pretty obvious from the front. I'm not using any of these hard drive bays, but I do still have a few of them included in here. They're pushed all the way in because that's how I mounted my acrylic panels to those. But normally, I guess if you weren't using them, you might just pull them all out so they're out of the way, or you'd have them pushed all the way in so it kind of looks flush in the front. And then, yeah, as far as the basement goes, there was plenty of space to fit my pump down here. I've got my drain valve. I used one piece of flex tube to connect. So basically, I've got the reservoir feeding the pump directly. The pump goes into the front red, and then it comes out, which is where where my drain valve is. Then this goes up to the other pass-through in the basement, and then routes through the loop the way that you saw it from the front. But yeah, plenty of space to work with down here. Even if I hadn't used custom cables, could have had plenty of space to stuff excess cables in this area, even with a portion of the loop being down here. And if all of your loop is above the basement, then you're going to have even more space to work with for that stuff. Now, normally you might mount your SSDs back here somewhere. I'm only using M.2, so I don't have anything mounted back here. That did make things a little bit easier. But there is there's a tray that goes over here to mount a couple SSDs. So plenty of space to do all that. But again, as with the front, if you guys have any questions about the way that I've done any of this, feel free to ask. So there you have it, guys. I hope you liked the build. As always, if you have any questions, or if you saw something in the build that you might like to see a tutorial on in the future, definitely leave that in the comments section below. I hope this video was somewhat informative and inspirational. And if you are considering the Dark Base 700 and you have any other questions about the case, feel free to ask. But I hope this was enough to sort of show you guys what would be possible if you are considering purchasing this case and installing your own custom loop. But that's it for now. I appreciate you guys checking out the channel, and I will see you in the next video.